certainly appreciate your gift of time. Our guest speaker is Joan Leotta. Joan has been playing with words on page and stage since her Pittsburgh childhood. Many of you may know her from her newspaper, writing, and book. Her poetry has been published in Germany, Ireland, England, and in many journals and magazines in the United States. In addition, for the past 30 years, she has also been a story performer, giving one-woman show on history, telling folk tales and personal stories at fairs, festivals, and in schools, museums, and libraries. She is the regional representative for the North Carolina Storytelling Guild, Tar Heel Tellers, and is very happy to be here with us tonight. We certainly thank you for giving us this opportunity for you to be here tonight. Thank you so much, and ladies and gentlemen, fellow Toastmasters and distinguished guests, please help me welcome Joan Leotta.
I'm very pleased to be here. I have an ulterior motive. I'm hoping that by telling you a story and then telling you about storytelling, that I can convince you to prepare a story. I'm going to tell a folk tale because it was easier for me to fit it into a short time. But I'm hoping that you will prepare either a folk or a personal tale to tell at what's called Telebration, which is an international celebration of story that takes place in November all over the world, and this is the first time we're going to have one in Brunswick County. It's going to be at the Sound House on November 4th from 6 to 8 p.m. Everyone is welcome. I'd like to know in advance, though, if you're coming. So I'll be sure to make room for you and be able to publicize the fact that you're coming. So I'm hoping that I can pull many of you, you in particular, since you expressed an interest, we can get Mary Lou to come, express an interest, and come and tell your stories, whether you want to tell a folk tale or a personal quote, they're welcome. So, I promised a story. Well, many years ago, there was an emperor who was very mean, and his wife was mean too, and she liked money more than anything else. If you were a poor person and you petitioned the queen, which was how it worked in their country, you petitioned the queen for food and favors and health things, her answer was always no. She spent more money on her flocks of turkey, geese, and hens than was given to the poor in the entire country. One day, a woman, a sagacious woman, who lived nearby in a small village, said to herself, I know how to get some food for all of us. Oh, said her friends, that's wonderful. How are you going to do it? The queen always says no. No worries, she says, I have a plan. And the woman went to the queen. Oh, great and wonderful queen, I have noticed walking by your wonderful pens of poultry that you have a particular type of turkey here who can be taught human speech. Oh, said the queen, really? Well, I do have good taste in picking things out, don't I? Listen, I can take those turkeys of yours and teach them not one, but 7 different languages in only 60 days, if you'll let me. Oh, said the queen, that would be wonderful. Just imagine when the foreign dignitaries come to visit, I'll trot out my turkeys. Gobble, 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 say their turkeys, but mine will speak to them. Okay, go ahead. Majesty, one little thing. All those turkeys, I don't have much food, so sure, said the queen. Make your list. I'll send you home with what you need. So the woman paraded home, followed by a flock of turkeys and servants carrying wheat, flour, dates, nuts, spices, oils, meats, wonderful things. And for 60 days, all the people in the neighborhood ate very well, because the woman was a very good cook. The turkeys, they just pecked around on the ground, eating bugs and such things that turkeys eat. At the end of the 60 days, the woman went back to the queen. Your Majesty, I have something to tell you. Well, I don't see my turkeys. Why don't you have them speak for you? No, Your Majesty. Your turkeys, no matter what language they speak, they all seem to say the same thing. Well, what is it? They all say, the queen has a lover. What? Said the queen. Kill those turkeys at once! Bow, your wish is my command. Went home, and 1 turkey a week fed the entire neighborhood until they were all gone. And that's the story. Now I have to put my glasses on. Learning to tell a story is really very easy. When you're writing up your own story, it's a bit harder because you have to put it down. But learning a story that's already on paper, you merely have to select a story that you like and it meets the age and interest of your audience. And by the way, I have handouts for you. I brought 10, but I can email more. Then you have to learn the story, and then you have to tell the story. Well, learn how to tell. You practice knowing the tale, restructuring it sometimes. I had to put an intro on it and an ending that I liked. I put the main points down on a card. That's personal. You practice for adding gestures and voices. Then you practice again with props, if you're going to use props. Then you practice again for timing. And then you just practice again. Enjoy sharing the tale with your audience. If you've picked a tale that you don't like, it's not worth telling. Because if you don't enjoy it, your audience isn't going to enjoy it. Number 1, when you come before an audience, and I'm sure you've learned this already in Toastmasters, is that you have to be confident that you're sharing something good with your audience. You have to respect your audience. I do not go with those old-fashioned things that said, oh, you just imagine all this stuff. No, I imagine that you are wonderful people, and I have something wonderful to share with you. That's how you prepare. That's how I prepare for a story. And then, after you've enjoyed telling the story, you think about your telling, just like Toastmasters do. I didn't realize I was fitting right in here. And I evaluate myself. How would I improve the story or change it up for the next routine? If I had had more time, because I'm taking a 45-minute talk and squeezing it into 10 minutes, I would have had a call and response. I would have had audience participation. That's one of the things I really like to do, is have you participate. Tips for structuring the story. You open it with something that's either dynamic and explodes the audience into the story, or something that's slow and sets the scene. This was the kind of story that lent itself to that slow setting the scene. I told you that the king was mean and his wife was even meaner, and she was cheap besides. She didn't like poor people. And then you have no more than 3 points of action in the story. I believe this story was so short it only had 2. And then you finish the tale. You can have a big flourish, something exciting happens, or a simple gesture, but you have to have a farewell at least, something that lets the audience exit the story, especially when you're dealing with children. You don't want to trap them inside a story. Their little minds will stay there. And I find that I do that. And then what a story is not, there are differences between written and oral storytelling, which you learn here in Toastmasters. So you guys are already above that, but I did look it up, and I put a Google reference on my sheet for you. And there are differences between storytelling and simply giving a speech. Because in giving a speech, you're often explaining or persuading. It's more like a piece of nonfiction. When you're telling a story, you might be explaining a part of your life or a short thing, but it's really more of a personal element. You're making more of a personal connection. And there's a whole reference about those differences too. So this is a book that I find very helpful. I also have a list of storytelling references for you. If you want to learn how to be a storyteller, I brought them. Again, if more of you want them than there are, I can always email. They're in my computer. They travel by email. This is a book that I got. This woman, Margaret Mcdonald, you'll see that she's one of the main listers. She's one of the best collectors of folk tales that I know. And she also gives permission to tell the story. We won't get into permissions and all of that today. But as long as you're telling for free, essentially you can tell just about anything. But as a professional, I have to watch all of that. And I'm very careful with giving proper permission, getting the proper permissions to tell someone else's rendition. I always make my own renditions, even out of the 3-minute story that you heard. If you went back and looked at it, it's not exactly the way Margaret Mcdonald had it down. So, but there's a man named Donald Davis, and I recommended his book to you. If you're making a personal story, if you want to tell a story from your own life, he has an extremely good way to do that. And it's short, it's small. I'm not sure if the library has it, but I have the name of it there, and I took them off of Amazon to make sure they were all still in print that I was recommending to you, because some of the old standards on my bookshelf are no longer in print. But all of these books, except for this one, this is a relatively new one, all the books that I put on the list, you can get used for as little as $1 in some places. So, and I recommend Donald Davis highly. I've also taken workshops from him. He's magnificent. He's a North Carolina storyteller also, but he is like light years into the stratosphere of storytelling.
I actually write fan fiction.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I don't do it for like money or anything, but I also
I know what fan fiction is.
Yeah, I post a lot of it online where I use other people's characters but make my own story with them.
Sure. As long as you're not telling for money, you are welcome to do that in an audience. And there are differences between writing the story and telling the story, but if you're telling a personal story or a fan fiction story, you have to take the piece that you've written down first. And I recently did an article for Sassy where it's called Bread and Olives, if you wanted to look it up online. And it's a story about when I was a little girl. It's about 600 words long. It's short enough. It would have worked for this too, but I would have had to read it. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to give you the idea of what storytelling really is, where you're actually telling the story. So like your fan fiction, if you have a piece of fan fiction that you've written and that you want to use as a performance piece, there's only a few, you just have to think about it a little bit. And you also have to watch your time. Because, for instance, at the, how many more minutes is that? One?
About 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. Well, thanks. Nice to see you all. And I have those handouts here for
Don't go yet, Joan. Thank you very much. Now we're going to have a 3-minute answering question for Joan.
Oh, okay.
And you can make any comments or answer or questions for her. So please.
One of the legacy programs in Toastmasters is storytelling. I think it's a 5-speech, it's really good. The other thing I found interesting is you're fully aware of the Grimm fairy tales. Anyway, there was a group of guys who used artificial intelligence to create a brand new Grimm fairy tale.
Interesting.
Just because they had all the characters and the structures and stuff like that, and just by using artificial intelligence, they could create from scratch a new Grimm fairy
I
tale.
wonder how many wicked stepmothers they killed.
Why are they always stepmothers?
Do we have any other question for
Yes.
I'm interested in personal stories. So does Donald Davis
The Donald Davis book is the one you want.
really? So he can give you guidelines on. I mean, I wonder how if you want to have the funny parts and then the more serious parts, but he goes into like how long those are supposed to be and like really technical stuff.
Well, I can't I haven't looked at my copy in a long time, but you also, some of that comes from practice, but he'll tell you how to essentially put it together. And that's another good reason to come to Telebration on the 4th, because, and by the way, you're very smart to want to inject funny stuff in your personal stories. Another reason why that story from Sassy was not a good story to bring here, because it didn't have I actually, when I'm doing something personal, or if I'm doing something longer, sometimes even for my written stories, I graph it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then I see where I want to inject something funny, where I want to get you to the point of tears,
Yeah.
where I want to bring you just smiling, and how I want you to end. So you have a lot of, graphing it is helpful. So
How long have you been storytelling?
more than 30 years professionally.
Oh, wow.
So since childhood,
Right.
I said I'm 72, almost.
What did you do before, as a profession, before you started getting into storytelling? Yes.
Well, I very sadly made a wrong career move. I started out as a journalist in college, and then I switched to political science because it was the 60s and you had to have something to write about. So then I had to go to economics in order to get a job, and I really don't like math. So then I worked as an economic analyst
Oh,
for the
wow.
government for 10 years, and then when I got married and decided that money wasn't important, so we live on one income, my husband really was glad for that. He's the one, I have to give him credit for that good idea, because I loved being home with my children, and I was glad both of our mothers worked, not because they had sterling careers, because they sort of had to. And I felt very privileged. I'd rather have less than be able to stay home. So then I wanted to do something. And that's when I I'd been trained in theater and decided to start storytelling and writing at the same time. So for all the time that we lived in Northern Virginia, I did both at almost a full-time pace, but I'm old now. And I don't do as much, I can't do as much of anything. I am a couch.
any other questions for Joan Leotta?
Sure. Okay, well, I have the handouts, and they'll be here, and you can pick them up after